Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Let's get into the lecture part of understanding what it is. So I want to kind of set some things on supply chain management and operations, because all of you may or may not be in the same space as far as operations and supply chain management. So for the next 1 hour, I just want to define a baseline for everyone. For some, it may be pretty simple. For some, it may be you're listening for the first time. So these are some of the objectives that we want to look at: basic concepts, the fundamentals, what is the role of HCM within healthcare, the complexities, how do you do the mitigation and risk, and then kind of Sujan has been helping me to put it into the Indian context, which is where you all come in, and let me know, what is the nuances that you see that helps you. Okay, first one is supply chain. We want to define it, right? Everybody thinks about it. The word supply chain became such a household name after COVID, when people couldn't find things. When shortages happen is when people think, what's wrong? Blame it on supply chain. But it's a network of facilities. Network, that's the critical word. And distribution options. When I first moved to the US 40 years ago, there was no online. To give a context to people, right? There's no online, no Google. It's not a question of purchasing online through mobile devices. And look at the options that we have today on distribution. And when first people started buying things online, when you went to the distribution facilities, they did not think, I need to reserve these things for online customers. They just had it. And if online patient came or online customer came, they would try to send the product that goes to the regular customer in a store to the online customer. And then people started becoming more nuanced as to the options. Functions of procurement of material, transformation, distribution of finished products, right? So that's what supply chain management is. Kind of introduce you all to supply chain basics. Everybody understands what the involved things are. So what is global supply chain management? I'm going to walk you through a few things to connect. So you can take some time to read these jokes if you want as we go through it. So anything that you do, right, is supposed to connect some value to, in this case, patient, if you are a healthcare. Amit, as an example, came in for a procedure. The value is having that procedure done on time and providing some input to his health. So that was the expectation of value. So supply chain management, his important role is to deliver that value. But the critical aspect of value, as you know, is value is not static. It's not the same thing. It defines over time. I'm talking to Sundar during the break, and he was talking about how rural areas today people collect health data through apps. And that was not there some time ago. So the value now is, how does this app moderate what happens between a patient in a rural area and a service provider sitting in an urban area trying to help a rural area patient. So the value is never going to be static. So supply chain is never going to be static. As the value proposition changes, supply chains have to reconfigure themselves to help. Sometimes that itself is what we call as the mismatch between a supply chain that is in the old times and the value has now shifted. An example that everybody understands is when we started shopping online, right? When you started shopping online, the delivery models for that is very different than if you go to a store to buy something. So the value proposition there has to match with what you want, when you want, and who's going to deliver it to you, as opposed to you going and buying something from a store. So for the value to be not static and change, the visibility and transparency are two important issues. So go back to our simple supply chain management. If I were to ask you to do in your daily lives, you would get frustrated because there's no visibility. The people that gave the raw materials never told you what raw material is going to come. They just said, I'm going to give you 4. That visibility, why? Because of a shortage is happening, is important for people to plan. And same thing can be talked about transparency. None of these 3 stages are the owner talking to the people on what the expectation is. I want everything in caps. The transparency of that information never came through. So that's important to define value, is that visibility and transparency. So that's the first thing. So day 5, I want you to, when you come back and talk about things that has impacted you, value is one of the things that you want to talk about. Okay, and continuing our thing is, what is global supply chain management? Customizing logistics. How many of you know that Amazon, when it started, for the first 7 years, it did not break even? 7 years. Such a behemoth it is today, but for the first 7 years, they did not break even, which means they were incurring loss. And majority of their losses were tied to logistics costs. They had one warehouse in Seattle, which they were using to distribute to the entire United States. They didn't figure it out. The idea of an online ordering was so alluring, taking things, and then they did not think about the cost of fulfilling that order. It took a long time before they figured out how to customize the logistics to supply to the customers, right? So today you talk about all kinds of orders, and you talked about this, putting people together, which becomes important from a value perspective. Amazon, here in this part of the world, you think like in 2 hours or 1 hour or 15 minutes, somebody said minute by minute delivery is happening. It's not the same in many places. That needs costs. If you're going to do things, you may do within a small geography. What if you want to do in a larger geography that? What if it involves a lot of rural areas that has transportation challenges? During the vaccine distribution, that was a huge deal. We worked with the community in Ghana and in Africa, and we had to deliver vaccines to the rural part. And drones were not possible. Sending it by road took a longer time. So we went to a company called zipline.com. Zipline is a company that provides all these adventurous travel between 2 mountains. You can ride. That's what they are famous for. We gave them the challenge as to how do you deliver vaccine, at one shot to a 60-kilometer radius. And they came up with an electronic catapult. Imagine a catapult, catapult. Now imagine a huge lever. At the end of the lever is a parachute. And you can aim to parts of where you want to deliver and swing that arm, and you could get a speed of landing at about 60 kilometers radius. So we had to think very, very creatively of various solutions where your normal solutions may not work. So this customizing logistics is not ordinary stuff. It changes with the environment and what happens. Sundar, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've also heard about Zipline. The kind of innovations that they do to deliver blood vaccines, even they said that now they have perfected the system that test tubes with blood and other important chemicals can be transplanted by that catapulting without it getting broken on the way. And it increases the accessibility, right? So people within 60 kilometers radius who are otherwise not accessible to these places now get a lot of value. It's wonderful, yes.
Thank you. So that's why I put that slide saying, so what's global supply chain management is that logistics customization, which every instance you think about, there's a logistics that need to be customized. Stop me if any questions, comments you have along the way. So, sure, please do.
So as well on that. So people can just go to YouTube and ask for Zipline delivering drugs, and then they can see those videos in action there.
After the course.
Yes, after the course.
Otherwise, whatever I say, you will tell me before time. Today, that's YouTube is my villain. No, just kidding. Thank you, Sundar. Yeah, it is. So that's on customizing logistics. What is the other aspect of global supply chain management? We saw this in today morning's, Mary and Amit and Ishan's story is that risk management. Constantly you're talking about how do I mitigate risks? Because risks are happening in very different forms and shapes. And this afternoon we'll talk a little bit more about resiliency and risk management, but that's a critical part of so when you talk about risks, and people talk this morning, how do you identify? How do you predict is one thing, and how do you mitigate? All those three kind of things. Remember, risks broadly falls into two categories. Things that happen frequently, but impact might not be very high. Things that happen very infrequently, but the impact is so high. COVID falls into the second category. Very infrequent occurrence, but the impact has been tremendous. Somebody forecasting something wrong might happen almost every day, but you could have solution around it, extra inventory, safety stock, whatever it is. So the impact might not be the same as you're talking about a white swan kind of an event that creates. So risk, and the digitization that has happened throughout the world today helps a little bit. Again, as I said, data rich, information poor. So be careful. Global supply chain management, as we try to define it, what is it? So we talked about value. We talked about risk mitigation. Now we're talking about process excellence as a way of customized logistics, and then now process excellence, which people talk about, the AAA supply chain, right? So supply chain should do three things. One, they should be agile. What does it mean? On a day-to-day basis, you may face uncertainties. Does the system recognize and provides you with alternatives? A particular route in a particular part of town is blocked. Do you have alternative routes to immediately route the truck or a car to go? That's an easier type of solution, but are you agile enough to do that? And so that's what we mean. Adaptability, there is things that shift. So how are you adapting to that is the question. COVID did something interesting in many parts of the world, which is called telemedicine. Telemedicine became an accepted form of consultation. Suddenly you're talking about, some things that's diagnosed, in a remote fashion. And once that happens, you need to have the infrastructure to support such a diagnostic that happens. Previously, it only happened one way, right? You went to a hospital, you met a surgeon or a physician, and that's how it happened. Now we're talking about a very different model. So is your system adaptable to such a change, a shift that happens? And alignment is something important. I mean, today we saw when we wrote the supply chain management, there was no alignment. People were just doing their own stuff. How do you get these people that were doing stuff today to align together and work? They talk to each other ahead of time. That's what we mean by the alignment of your incentives. And how do you jointly measure success as opposed to just one group saying, we did our job well. We wanted to give 4 units and we gave 4 units. Our job is done because I told them you need to give only 4 units. So that's what we mean by the alignment is finally I got only one good thing. So that's the measure, right? So I got only one is the measure. How do I align so that doesn't happen and I increase is what we're talking. Flexibility, I think, is a characteristic that gives you the agility. We went and gave the same example, right? Where we said, I have an alternate route. That flexibility that you have an alternate route provides you the characteristic to be more agile. So it's one of the characteristics of agility is flexibility. So I don't think it's an odd, it's a complementary thing to it. So as before we move, I just wanted to throw some supply chains to you. As you look at, there are 4 different types of supply chains. There are many supply chains. And supply chains within a supply chain is also evolving. But here is one where you talk about a heavy material extraction type of a supply chain like aluminum, which is used on many places. And it is a very different type of a supply chain than a retail, which has many dissimilar kind of parts that are working together. And a healthcare, which also has very many players. You got the payers, you got the customers, which are the patients, you got the material manufacturers, the distributors, the manufacturers, the pharmaceuticals, when you look at tomorrow, we're going to talk about the whole idea of vaccine distribution and what happened. Why did we do things so fast? When product development activities in vaccine used to take 10 years, how could we do it in 1 year and get that done? And there are some issues that we learned to do it better, but from an equity standpoint. But otherwise, what a speed with which we helped mankind. So what happened? So that's what we are talking about. And of course, today we are also not limited to this planet. We are interplanetary. There are systems that are talking about taking waste to another planet. It's not a good thing, in my opinion, but if you want to, you could. So systems are so different and supply chains are very different. Okay, this is Sujan's model, so I need to talk about it. He put it together. How has it evolved over a period of time? It's important to know why we are talking about logistics, why we are talking about procurement. So in 1960s, if you want to go and study about supply chain management, it was highly fragmented. People like what we saw today in the class when we played the simulation game. Some people talked about forecasting, others talked about sourcing and purchasing, requirements planning, but never together. So all very disconnected, those kind of things. And then 80s, you saw more consolidation, which became materials management was the word. When I worked with Lucas TVS, my title was materials manager. That was my title in the 80s. And all I did was to make sure that the materials are available at the different machines to do what you had to do. But I did work on one side with the suppliers and one side was my customers. Maruti was just coming in. We had moved from 2 vehicles to 3 in terms of cars. Suzuki was coming in. Suzuki was trying to tell us that anything made in India was bad quality so that they could bring it from Japan. So my title then became Materials Quality Manager from Materials Manager. Now we have to talk about quality, certification. So materials management was what it is, and then it evolved more into logistics. Everything that moves, everything that flows, how do you look at it within a supply chain was what, because many times what happened was, within the 4 walls of a factory, we were very good. When I used to work in Lucas TVS, we used to get all the Deming Awards of the world. Within the factory, we were fantastic with just-in-time and all those time. The moment you left the factory, everything fell apart because it's the supply chain that was weak, whereas we were very good internally. So this whole logistics was coordinating across, not just within a particular plant. And that led more towards the supply and delivery side of things, so supply chain management award that was formed in the early 2000s. And of course, 2010 and later, the computer revolution started putting more digital footprints, as I call it, right? So digital footprints, whatever you try to do. So they're talking about apps as a way of collection. The same healthcare worker now can go, my daughter about a few years ago said at CMC she was going with a nurse, and all the nurse did was from 1960s she maintained handwritten logs of a particular house in a rural area. They were seeing a third or a fourth generation delivery, but she had everything written down, and if the notebook went away, everything went away. So now the same thing is a digital footprint of the whole thing. That helps now for distribution of the data to many people to look at different kinds of things. So the digitization has its own benefits. Sundar, any thoughts? Anything you want to comment on it?
I think the one aspect about digitization is it's also keeps people who don't want to come to hospital at their homes, right? That is, now they call it virtual care. So the government, since the hospitals are already overcrowded, because we have a lot of people living with diseases on the planet, the digitization sort of helps people to, if they don't have to come to hospital, they need not come. They can be kept at home, but without compromising the quality of care. And so now I think they have certain devices, small devices like Fitbits that they attach to the patients. And then the ASHA workers or any of these people can monitor it from a distance. And if there is something wrong, they just have to just visit them. So unnecessary hospital visits are avoided. At the same time, some remote care is provided. So that is also the next wave of digitization that's happening. Yeah.
So if you want to continue with your historical milestones, some of the things that happened along the way has led the path to where we are today. If you were in the early 1900s, the whole idea of assembly line, I mean, what we did today was some kind of an assembly line, right? So step by step things happen, and finally a product comes out, or a step by step you do service and a final service outcomes happen. The kind of thought process came from what we call as the assembly line. It gave what's called as the efficiencies to doing things, the economies of scale. As you're scaling up to more population or scaling up to doing more products, the assembly line became very important, which led to the next wave, which is mass producing things, as the globe wanted more things, but based on the wars, which taught us more, unfortunately or fortunately, about logistics. Most of the logistics that you see on coordination and collaboration comes from wars. That's where, and then it moved to the civilian world. Then as we moved through the 70s and 80s, people, again, remember my title, my materials manager, and that's the time the MRP became very, very common, the material requirement planning, because everything was looked at as materials, and how do you manage the materials? And that led to integration of different types of functions. For the first time, we thought about, okay, we need to look at marketing and supply chain together as functions, because marketing touches more the customer side of things. And supply chain is to help customers meet what their value is. So how do you kind of integrate functions? And digitization to some extent helped us do that. Then we said, why do you have to do things within one geographical zone? Why can't you bring the whole world as a village? The whole world as a village became a concept which led to outsourcing. And the core competencies said, I am good at doing these things. The rest I would outsource to somebody else too. And again, the collaboration and digitization helped. Then Japanese came along. They said, how do we excel in the world? And they said just in time and total quality. Those are the two ways we got to do. You don't have to do anything before it has to be done. That's the spirit of just in time. And you should be doing it such that zero defects. Zero defects is the way to go. That's the total quality management. So those two concepts became, managing, gelling together. As a matter of fact, in the early 2000s, there was a report brought out in the United States called "To Err is Human" for the healthcare, looking at all the defects that happen in the healthcare, which led to a lot of hospitals trying to implement this just-in-time and other systems in their own healthcare environment, with mixed results. it's a good thing. You don't want to go to the hospital that says, we have the best just-in-time system here running us versus we take care of patients. So you got different value propositions here. Though we learned a lot from how just-in-time can be applied to any system where you're doing the right thing at the right time with the right type of material and the right type of people. You got to be cautious. And of course, supply chain came along. We talked about ERPs and digitization. And now, thanks to what Sundar was talking about, how these digital tools are embedded into delivering the care. More the embedded kind of a philosophy. Internet of Things, robotics, the Fitbit type of things. Simple things that can be embedded that collects data automatically is a part of that. All right. So all good, right? So the world has taught us, history has taught us a lot of things. But why is then supply chain management not that simple? Why is it difficult? We go back to the example this morning, simple writing down, where if instructions are not carefully done, if things are not properly laid out, what kind of chaos or what kind of efficiency issues can cause. So now take it in a global sense with the number of products, number of suppliers, number of complexities that you have to deal with, cultural issues to bring in, and political issues that always creates all types of interesting scenarios. So supply chain is not easy because of it. I'll give you one example, and then I'm going to put Sundar on spot to see if he has any other example to explain why supply chain is different. So we were in Ghana. We worked with Zipline to say, okay, we're going to use the catapult to send the vaccines. Still, we had a huge problem because healthcare systems in every country is so different. In Ghana, the Ministry of Health clearly said, who can administer the vaccine? It has to be a doctor. Now, I can't put the doctor on a parachute and just send them like that. I wish I could, but we cannot. Right? So we had a problem. We had the medicine. We had nursing, or people trained in providing kind of injections, but they were not authorized. So we had to do something very interesting. We had to make the Department of Health change their policy, but they would not. In a lot of countries, the policy changing guidelines comes from WHO. They go with WHO policies. So we had to urgently conduct a meeting because remember, it's still COVID times. Not many people are meeting. So we had a meeting in a room like this, where on screen were people from WHO. In the room were supply chain experts, Ghanaian doctors, nursing care people, all distanced with masks, and the Ministry of Health. And we had 3 or 4 sittings that way to make a policy change so that nurses can administer vaccines. Supply chain is difficult because it involves people. It involves compliance issues. It involves regulatory kind of issues, which change with geography, changes with cultures. So, Sundar?
So, I also recently heard about a case where when people were trying to manufacture vaccine, they coordinated everything perfectly, but then for the vaccine to be produced, the vials, the medicine, the the equipments, all of them have to come at the same place for them to get perfectly assembled and go out. And somebody did a small mistake that they forgot to order the bottle caps. So everything was there, but only the bottle caps were not there, just the opening caps, and then because of that, they could not produce. And the second biggest issue is they fixed the issue, and then they forgot the fact that they need cold storages in different places to transport them to the need. And the refrigerated vehicles were not there. And because of that, when the vaccines reached on time, but most of them lost 60 to 70% of their efficiency. And because of that, so even because of even if there is perfect planning, a small thing, just like a bottle cap or the wheels cap can, sabotage the entire process.
Wonderful. Beautiful example. All right. So these are some of the things, sustainability and ethical practices in many parts are varying. Europe has the most stringent kind of sustainability and quality practices. Other countries, a little bit on different types of spectrum. So that itself, as you move products, as you source products, creates the complexities that we're talking about. And then anything to do with regulatory kind of changes, rising costs and quality control, that's another thing. Things are not static, cost-wise. Volatility and demand uncertainty is the number one issue. I want to give you a very, very US-based example, but I think you will enjoy it. So in the US, 65% of the population own pets. It's a statistic, right? So pet food and pet toys are a huge industry. And like many industries, they are all seasonal. And one of the huge seasons in the US is the Christmas season. And interestingly, the toys for pets, for human beings, the Christmas season ends with the Christmas 25th, But for pets, it goes up to the first week in January. When we looked at the data, sometimes people bought it on time. Sometimes, pets were cheated and said, we're going to get you the gifts a little later after we get it to family and whatever. But anyway, the seasonality went. That's not the story. In one of the years, there's this company called PetSmart, which is probably about $11 billion kind of a company that produces food for the pets and also toys for the pets. And one of the toys that they produce is called Wiggly Giggly. It is exactly what it is. It wiggles and it giggles. So they did a market test, became a huge hit. And so the company had to decide, because most of the orders, it's a porcelain-based doll, and it was completely manufactured in China. So from a sourcing perspective, you ought to get it from China. So they did the market test. They said, okay, this is how much they will sell. They looked at the demand uncertainty around those kind of products, and they made a best guess that people normally make based on it. They ordered. By the way, 90-day, lead time. So 90 days it takes from the time you place the order to get 3 months, which means. So, and by November, these have to be in town so that they all get into the stores. So the whole distribution is not, because the season starts somewhere after Thanksgiving in the US, the purchasing of for Christmas. So everything was intact, fantastic. And then there was this daytime talk show host called Oprah Winfrey. Somebody might have known. She used to be a huge personality then. And she did a segment in her shows called What's the Hot Item to Buy? And that year, for some reason, she thought about Wiggly Giggly. So she took that and showed it to the cameras and said, and she made her dog run with it. And the dog was all excited. So suddenly, the demand went through the roof. A lot more than what they expected. So they had to do a lot of rush orders, to bring them by air and things like that. The story does not end there. Okay, so that Christmas somehow PetSmart had a good Santa in terms of the Wiggly Giggly, and they sold a lot of toys. But the next year, somebody was making a forecast. Guess what they did? They looked at the previous year's sales and placed an order similar to that. There is no Wiggly, there's no Oprah effect. The demand was probably saturated, but somebody made a decision wonderfully saying, we're going to forecast similar to this. And this was 15 years ago. And there is a warehouse in Phoenix, Arizona, which still has Wiggly Giggly toys in it, yet to be sold. So the demand volatility and uncertainty is a huge part of what you think about in a supply chain that makes it complicated. Some of these things we have already gone through: value, minimize some of the costs, customer needs, right data, coordination. So we will see as I think some of the decisions that supply chain people do. We talked this morning about location. If we can put the location decisions together, it'll be nice. But sometimes it's the politics that decides the location. Sometimes it's actually the good economic sense that decides where to do things. It's easier to do the second one because we can think through it. Economics-wise, how do you do it? Sometimes you're forced to do it on location decisions. Location is also on clusters. You know, many of the back offices, many of the interesting technologies located here because it's a cluster of things that happen. Then comes the production decisions. What products to produce, which plants to produce them in. And in the healthcare, they also talk about adding value at the warehouse, which is the kitting. A lot of healthcare needs, remember Mary, we talked about, she needs a kit of items to put that IV together. So this kitting kind of values can be done in a warehouse where products come in and then they are put it together in a medical cabinet or a shelf and things like that. Inventory decisions are the other ones. How do you manage inventory? Remember, what's his name? Ishan was having a 3-week or a 2-week, whatever it is in the case that I gave you, type of inventory. So those are decisions to be done. Transportation decisions, the sizes, and how do you make the development and scheduling of those kind of things. So some of the supply chain decisions, some of them are short-term, some are long-term, right? Some, you know, the design of a system, transportation system, tells you how to distribute. So some are long-term kind of decisions. Worked with a company here, I forget the name, that set up the railroad system to transport cars between Chennai and Delhi. And so they had a lot of dedicated lines doing this. We can also talk about supply chain issues in terms of strategic versus tactical versus operational. So go back to our simulation this morning with Mary's team. Strategic issues are where do you source those things? How do you source even a $3 item? What is the inventory decisions? Tactical is more day-to-day kind of a thing, or you know, more operational is almost by the hour what you do. I think we are going to show some of simulation-based approaches in a couple of days to explain these things to you. Sujan has been very thorough. He gives me different type of angles to tell you. Another way of the supply chain to look at is cycle view of supply chain. Supply chains have different types of cycles. Here are some examples. Because these cycles happen with their own time periods, right? A customer order cycle, if you think about it, customers might order every day. Orders come in by every hour, every minute. Whereas when you go to replenishment cycle, go back to our friend, Ishan, he's going to do it once in 3 weeks, once in 2 weeks, kind of things to replenish things. So his cycle time is slightly different than the day-to-day what happens. He's not doing a day-to-day order placement. The manufacturing cycle, because of economics of scale of this valve that you looked at, they are looking at globally how much should I manufacture. They are not looking at just your hospital. So their cycle might be even longer. When they set up a machine, they want to manufacture these valves as much as possible before changing over to something else. They have economies of scale there. And then a procurement cycle on a general, for them to procure things to do that, that may be a different cycle. You have to go to a plastic manufacturer to get plastic. So that cycle is very different than the manufacturer manufacturing the valve, than the replenishment within a hospital of that valve to Mary using that valve on a daily basis. Look at this particular thing and you will understand the cyclical way of supply chain happens. Another way of looking at it is what's called as the push-pull view of supply chains, where you talk about things that are driven by demand. So you're pushing things by demand. I need 15 units of this every day. That kind of a demand drives how many should I carry in inventory. Pull is actually happening only when a signal comes that you're going to send that product to you. Example are things like today what happens in Swiggy. When you order, things get assembled and sent to you. So the pull of the signal is what sets the next thing to. They may have a push strategy on maintaining inventory of a few things, but the pull is what makes them deal with when the product is assembled. Again, another way of looking at what I talked about, the complexity of healthcare in terms of different kind of stakeholders, different type of resources that are needed to various kind of daily, weekly, monthly kind of things. By now, you should know why we are wanting to deal with healthcare supply chain. The most complex, most critical, more cost kind of issues that dominates uncertainty in demand. A length of stay is the most uncertain kind of a variable in many of this. We're trying to see in a hospital, if people can nail what the length of stay is, they can go backwards and align all the resources for that. But the length of stay is not as a simple one. And also the entities that are dealing with in healthcare are so kind of dispersed. The ones that are doing the insurance versus the regulatory bodies versus the government, the wholesalers and retailers are very dispersed in a healthcare system compared to other types of systems, which makes the role of supply chain management in healthcare much more difficult to deal with. We talked about 2 cards with dot saying they are defective. It's easy to identify those and say at your source, you should have removed them and given only good cards. But what if the compliance kind of and the regulatory things, as you're providing the services, when example is when Mary decides to go and do a different kind of kit with a valve, then she needs an extra nurse to qualify that. That's a compliance issue that comes because of escalation that Mary did as a nurse. So those type of uncertainties creates a much more complicated scenarios in the healthcare system. We talked about digitization, and healthcare, is an area where it's prone to a lot of digitization. Some are still in the nascent stages, some are very advanced stages. So how do you kind of coexist with this nascent and advanced information system stage and make decisions? Here are some examples that you see given together in different type of system, patient-based and hospital-based information systems. So the electronic health records all work with the patient side of things. But how do you use that to translate to? So one of the examples I think I'm going to talk about when we talk about AI in healthcare is how do you leverage these systems to do a better job. This is just looking at drug flow. Movement of drugs through the supply chains is by itself an interesting problem, right? One of the critical aspects of drugs is what? Shelf life. So that's a different area of supply chain. When you have shelf lives, somebody talked today, when you remove something, then you got to use it. And so that has an important impact on our information. Sundar, any thoughts, points about what we're talking?
The shelf life is very important. For example, if we, most importantly, we study this in the context of blood, right? So if we take blood from people, and then if we don't use it, it's like taking blood from the people and putting it down the drain. But at the same time, if we are cautious and then we are, we're not taking blood, then somebody's life is at stake. So you always calculate the cost of underage, of not having it, and then the cost of overage, having excess of it. And in healthcare, it's a very tricky issue, right? Because since lives if there's a bookstore, if a book is not there, worst case, we can always place an order later or somewhere. But if blood is not there, somebody's life is at stake. But you have excess of blood, you're taking blood, it has a period of shelf life of 21 days or something. And after that, you are taking the blood and putting it down down the drain, then so that kind of complications always comes in healthcare, and it's very important to capture them, whether it's drug or blood or stem cells or anything.
Very important. Especially with blood, there are two parts to it. One is the blood by itself moving through a system so that it is administered in a transfusion kind of a system, and then taking products out of the blood to create products that are also important for surgery and other things. For both, the shelf lives are very different. And so from a collection standpoint, as the blood moves through the supply chain, its journey is extremely interesting. Thank you for bringing that up, because that leads to this one. Thank you. I didn't know what slide is coming next, but patient safety supply chains are so important part of, because you have safety issues in many supply chains, but in healthcare, that's the dominant issue. Is patient safety. So how do you make sure that you have a system where expired products are looked at and decisions are made based on it? How do you optimize any type of emergency workflows? What do you have to plan for emergency workflows. And emergency systems can happen as a patient is going through a normal routine too. Something can develop. And it has to then, the emergency protocol has to kick in and you got to do things. So data analytics and maintaining accurate data of patient are a critical part of patient safety supply chains. We talked about blood bank. We talked about pharmacies. We got the mundane things like billing and collection departments. Those are important parts of supply chains. Lab-based systems, then the physical product itself, the inventory systems. They all coexist. They all mingle together in a supply chain. So we talk about complexity. We talked about it in the beginning. That's what makes it even more complex as you look at things. So this is another way of looking at the complexity, all the fundamental aspects. The suppliers that have to think about the final outcome of the patient as they are looking at the products. The procurement aspect of it. Many of these, think about a hospital and you are there. Go back to our Ishan, who's our procurement manager, right? We brought him in the beginning. Ishan has to think about that $3 valve, which itself can create a ripple effect. We showed it. Ishan also has to think about a stent that goes in. So $3 to maybe this is $10,000 stent that goes in. And the range to maintain inventory policy on a stent where the relationship might be directly with the supplier. Because the supplier and the hospital has more direct relationship. With this valve, they may or may not have a direct relationship with the supplier. It's brought out in an open market with a distributor, with even general market that comes in as a procurement. So the range of things that Ishan, as a procurement specialist in a hospital, has to manage is much more complex. Depending on the hospital, of course, we are talking about a large-scale hospital kind of a system. And the forecasting that goes with that. The demand forecasting that goes with even this valve, if not properly done, created a ripple effect today you saw. Demand forecasting of a very high value, what is called as a physician preferred item. It's called a PPI or a physician preferred items. Physicians are an interesting breed of animals. They have large egos and they have interesting choices that they do in hospitals. They will work with only certain type of products, even though that may increase the cost of procurement. And so, Ishan has to deal with this extreme end of products to look at, and at the same time talk about emergency preparedness like a COVID. That has a different type of a protocol, right? People could not enter into a facility. They had to wave in and open and so on and so forth. And so that's what the fundamental aspects of the supply chain talks about, all those type of things. So talk about diverse stakeholders, regulatory compliance, product complexity, supply chain visibility. How much time do we have to end? So let me know. Okay. All right. So I will give you a handout as you leave, and then you can come back and look at it. But I want to set up this product complexity and leave you with this thought as you're looking at it, which is my own personal experience. So September of last year, I had an open heart surgery. Okay, so I went through the system. It was a preventive surgery. That was the interesting thing. So you got to put that in mind. I did not have a heart attack. I didn't have any kind of issues. Anybody who has a internet, look up the word Bentall, B-E-N-T-A-L-L, B-E-N-T-A-L-L procedure. Tell me, somebody read out. It should be a short. Bentall. Yes, you got you got it already. So it's with you. I didn't know that you guys had it. The handout already given. You don't have to look then. It's not about the procedure. It's not about me. It's about the supply chain behind that particular procedure is what I want you to understand about the complexity for supply chain. We started today's session by a $3 valve. But Bentall procedure, I had my heart's aorta completely replaced. There was another part of the heart that was replaced. So this is a product, it's a plastic brace product that was placed. Now the sourcing of those products, if you go through what I have given you, some of these are extremely complex products. Any biomedical kind of a product, it takes time to manufacture these valves. They have to manufacture these valves. The yield is like a semiconductor industry. When you want 100 units, you may lose 1,000 units before you get that 100 units type of yield. So the complexity of the product that goes into these type of surgeries, the sourcing of that is very interesting. How do you do a demand forecasting? Mine took only 1 week when the hospital system said, I have some symptoms, it's time to change. So the demand forecasting did not give a lot of time. Of course, the surgery was a month later, so they gave them about a month to decide. So you don't stock up on these things. That's what I wanted to tell. You can stock up on the valves that you saw. You can make a decision on that. How do you make decisions on these type of complex product that goes into your body? And how do you stack them? What's your inventory policy? What's your forecasting on those kind of things? Just want you to understand the complexity of the type of things people do with the humans and the need for the procurement. It's the same Ishan who has to worry about the $3 valve has to worry about the valve that goes into a heart. So, range of products to think about. And the visibility varies very much. My $3 valve, if you go check it out, hundreds and thousands of suppliers are there in the world to do that. Because that valve, interestingly, is not used only in your IV. It is used in plumbing, where you don't want things to flow back. So it's a much broader type of application of the valve that can be used in a hospital system also somewhere else. So the number of suppliers, the valve that goes into the heart, there's not many other places. And it also has to be customized. The other thing is you have to customize it. So certain things have to be done and you have to customize. So all these things increases the complexity and the regulatory compliance that we have for that $3 valve is very different. There is not much of a regulatory compliance as much as you're talking about engineering compliance, technical compliance. Whereas the valve that goes into the heart, the regulatory compliance is much different. And then there are choices. There's not much of a choice in the plastic valve, other than product quality and things like that. I was given two choices. Do you need a mechanical valve or do you need a synthetic valve? plastic paste. How do I choose as a patient? So they give you the pluses and minuses. One doesn't have to be replaced. The valve that I chose to do has to be replaced in 20 years. And then there are additional complications. As the surgery went through, my electrical impulses never came back. So they had to put a pacemaker. So again, talking about length of stay, complications, complexity, and the process of planning for those things. So I talked to the procurement person. I mean, the CEO of this particular hospital was my student from my EMBA days. So he gave me full access. He said, you can talk to anybody you need to talk about this. So I went and talked to the procurement person. Procurement person said they had to do a lot more thinking on how they procured the particular type of valve compared to what they did with the other kind of products. So stakeholders are diverse: regulatory compliance, product complexity, supply chain visibility, demand variability that I talked about, think about the products. Cost pressures are more on this smaller kind of items. So you want to make sure that you are not, you don't want to be cheap with that valve, but it's a functional item. So you don't want to pay an arm and a leg to buy that. Whereas with the valve that goes into the heart, their cost pressures are very different. The cardiac surgeon would prefer one type of valve. They actually deal with a few companies. They actually help those companies develop those valves. So the relationships are very different than the $3 valve that you saw. So I just want you to have that in mind as you're thinking about the logistical challenges are very different, right? That's a mass item that just comes in a truck. This doesn't come in a truck. The manufacturer's salesperson hand delivers these products. The manufacturer's quality control person was there outside as the surgery takes place. So a lot more involved the manufacturer is with this type of a product than a $3 valve that you looked at.
The temperature controlled vaccines, drugs, just imagine at any point, if we are failing to control the temperature, the whole product is gone. No matter at which point of supply chain we are in. That's the weakest link that decides the strength of supply chain. Okay, that's very important point. Second aspect I want to emphasize is on supply chain is good. What about the waste? Okay, how we can make it more sustainable. Okay, so those are all aspects of healthcare supply chain, very important, how you manage the waste, So we generate, just Google it, how much waste we are generating every day in this healthcare sector. How to manage that, right? It's reverse supply chain. We will see that. Is it possible that reverse supply chain is possible in healthcare or not, right? What we have to do. So these are some food for thought for you to think over food at lunchtime. Okay?
Yeah. Then we'll come back and continue. Thank you all.